All right, thanks everybody. It's awesome to be here. I really kind of have this amateur interest in linguistics, but know literally nothing about it. So sitting in on listening to the talks today was pretty cool. Today I want to talk to you about the work I have been doing basically over my entire career. Basically, I spent 16 years at Microsoft Research with two missions. Basically, the first half, I studied software developers. So I got to watch software developers work. I got to listen to them, observe them, maybe sometimes influence them, and figure out how they work together to build large-scale pieces of software. And Microsoft is one of the largest companies that builds the largest software on the planet. But as an academic, I kind of got bored. And after a while, we started looking at autistic software developers, and Microsoft is one of those places that has plenty of autistic people that work there in computer science. And looking at them, we kind of discovered that autistic people had some special powers in programming, but mostly they experienced lots of discrimination from other people on their teams for the ways that they communicated. And I thought, I could do something about this. And I worked on that for a while, and then I left Microsoft a few years ago and came to Carnegie Mellon University, where I get to exploit my researcher ADHD, and I get to do all the projects I ever wanted to do with no manager telling me no. So now, as Al said, I work on creating inclusive workplaces for everybody, especially neurodivergent people, looking at the ways that we can train both the neurodivergent and the neurotypical to work together better. And a lot of that is really through improving communication and relationships. So today I'm going to talk to you about how communication is incredibly important in the field of software. It's not just about a geek who lives in their parents' basement and doesn't talk to anybody while they produce something like Microsoft Windows. That's not how this really happens. Software development takes a huge number of people, and we'll talk about how that in fact works. So the way I kind of think about software is really software is made by people, which eludes actually a lot of the public. Those people work together, so that's kind of a nice addition to it. They talk a lot to get that work done, or sometimes they don't actually talk enough, and that inhibits getting work done. So it's all about talking and communication, and that's super fun. So what we know is that teams of people from, let's say, 5-person teams that work together on a daily basis, up through, let's say, 8,000 people, like the kind it takes to build Microsoft Windows, they need to work together in a team in order to build those software products. So they require tons of developers. They divide themselves up into teams, and the organization of those teams is hierarchical, but it also resembles the design of the software. And this is something known as Conway's Law. It came out in the 1950s. Basically, the communication that occurs between teams and between members of the team resembles the software architecture of the thing they're trying to produce. And it seems to hold in every single case we've ever looked at in software, and it's bidirectional. It's pretty awesome, really cool theory. I guess we call it a law because it seems to hold all the time. Basically, the connections between the teams are dependencies. So I build an application that depends on somebody's library to make the thing work. And if I depend on you, if my team depends on your team to make something work, well, that means that I'm giving up a little power and a little control. Because now, if you don't get your thing done, I can't ship my code. And that looks bad for me. But I don't have the capacity to do everything because I'm only so many people on my team, and we just can only do so much, so we need other teams to help us build large-scale software. So there's a tension here between trying to get the whole thing done by ourselves and being in control and giving up that control and power to other people and having to communicate with them in order to be able to get our parts of the products to work together. Now, the way we think of teamwork is around coordination work. And so coordination in the model that I've used a lot over the past 15 to 20 years, it's made up of 3 pieces. Communication, so people have to understand what you're asking them to do. Capacity, which means they have to be able to do what I'm asking them to do. And then also cooperation, which means they need to be willing to do what I want them to do. And then, in fact, actually, that's where a lot of dysfunction comes from. The teams in high-tech companies are typically very autonomous. They get to work on their own. There's no boss kind of dictating exactly how they get to work. Because of that, they often get to set their priorities for themselves. And what they do is they look how many customers do we have, and that could be internal or external customers, and they prioritize the needs of those, let's say, top 3 customers that they've got, and say whatever those three customers want, we're going to do. And what happens if you're not the top customer? Well, you don't get what you want. In fact, you often get ignored and you get not listened to. In fact, even worse, because communication doesn't always work between teams, you might not even know, in fact, that you're not a top customer, because they're not going to tell you, because that's too much power. But they also might not tell you when, let's say, like, you asked for a work item to be done, and then they randomly decided at one of their meetings, no, we're not going to do that, and then never told you. And so you're sitting here waiting a few months for somebody to be able to give you the power to make that dialog box orange, and they've decided not to let you do that and never told you that you can't do that. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I can't ship my code because it has to be orange. Now what am I going to do? So that's where bad things tend to happen. Let me give you a quote here. So we have done lots of studies, so I'm pulling some quotes from different studies of software teams. This is in particular from a team that had 3 different divisions, one in Boston, one in Redmond, and one in India, that had grown up almost overnight because their product was a success. So they grew from 30 people to 300 people in about 6 months. That led to lots of communication problems. And one of the people that we were speaking with said, I know they have other priorities in their jobs. They'll say, I'll give you time tomorrow. So I'm like, why don't you just take 15 minutes right now and save me an entire day of work? And this is basically the challenge of communicating with somebody in India who is 12 hours off from people at Microsoft in Redmond. As soon as you say, my kid has soccer practice, I'm going to go home now and not respond to that email, then that person now is waiting an additional 24 hours to get any answers from you, if you even remember to give that answer the next day. The reason people do this is because I'm sure this is not news to anybody in this room, but people are really bad at communicating. Like, we don't know how to do it. We're not good at it, especially with other people. We don't work in groups really well. Often, universities don't really teach how to work in groups. They kind of just assume you can figure it out for yourselves. I kind of drew up a list amongst all these teams of, like, what were some of the unhelpful kinds of behaviors that we saw when we asked them about how they're interacting with the other teams, those 300-person teams. So we saw lots of instances of miscommunication, tons of instances of mistrust of other teams, especially as the team grew. People mistrusted all the newbies. There were a lot of misunderstandings when you would shoot off a really quick email and it wouldn't have all the details that you needed, and in fact, somebody else didn't really get what you were asking for. Super dysfunctional. I'm amazed. This is being recorded, right? So I'm amazed sometimes Microsoft actually can ship software, but like it does, and they have really good salespeople, so yay for them. Many times you would ask for something from somebody else and they wouldn't meet your expectations. They have different priorities. There's just lots and lots of things. Basically, I kind of consider everything on the left of like people you should not date. These are bad relationship signs. If these are happening to you, you should run away. Do not marry these people. So like an example, for a quote that we found, he doesn't answer email. If I have questions, I have to ping him a couple of times to get an answer. And more than usually a couple times. Now, we contrasted these with behaviors of people that were helpful. So they proactively communicated, which is super nice. They prioritized their communication. In fact, they decided it's more important to make sure everyone is in sync than to get my own work done. They don't escalate to management when they could just answer something for themselves. They actually listen to you when you ask a question and don't just answer a question they have in their own head instead of the one that you've asked. They seem to actually pay attention to their customers, even the ones who are not the top, which is really nice. Especially the notion of customers is hierarchical. So it's your team as a customer, your product has customers, but you yourself have dependents, and customers essentially depend on what you do. And knowing who depends on you is really hard for people, because unless those dependents tell you that they're using your stuff, you have no idea. Because the software is really large, you just check into a repository, you have no idea who actually uses your stuff. So when they complain to you, then it's easy to figure out who they are, and you can keep aware of that, which is nice. They deliver things on time. If they promise something, they deliver it, which is really nice. They, in fact, even ask you, when do you really want it? When do you need it? I can make sure I get it for you in time when you need it. Again, these are the people you should marry. So what we do see is that if you are working with teams that you communicate well with, those teams tend to work together a lot. So I would appreciate a week before update to know if they'll make the date or where they are. So like that's just an example of like just keeping me in sync with your schedule. It's really important to a lot of people. Now, if you work with a team and you like them, you make a nice personal relationship with those individuals, and you tend to go the extra mile for that person because now you know them and you're friends with them and you want to keep them as friends. It's like a little social capital thing. So like their support team volunteered to go in and do that work manually. That's a case where they took the initiative, they dedicated the resources, and they recognized the magnitude of the problem, and they solved it for me. That's awesome. That's what you want to see. That's how you want to see all teams in all companies everywhere, everyone helping each other out and making sure that things get done. Now, what we find companies, really large companies, have become geographically distributed. So this is like I was saying before, Microsoft had a team in Boston, they had a team in Redmond, they had a team in India. Microsoft actually has offices all over the world where they do development. And what we find is there's challenges once you go geographically distributed that are not necessarily just related to time zone. Time zone we can't fix, sadly. But the structures that the teams form with respect to that remote boundary really can induce poor communication for the distributed team members amongst themselves as well as with the manager itself. So obviously you can't talk face-to-face, which means you cannot have a water cooler conversation or a kitchen conversation where you can like get something done really quickly. There's no chance for small talk or shared lunches or outside activities when you have a Zoom meeting with somebody, or it was Microsoft, a Teams meeting, or at the time, what was it, Office Communicator? Everyone just gets to work. They don't have fun, random conversations about their weekend because that's wasting time. So now these people who you've never actually met in person, you don't get to know as people. All you get to know about them is exactly what they did to your code last week. What that does to the team is that there's basically lots of opportunity for ambiguities that linger over long periods of time, misunderstandings, miscommunication. And in fact, actually, what happens actually most often is missing communication where there should be communication, but it's not actually happening. So let me give you some well, the other thing we kind of thought of as a result of this is basically communication should be really continuously proactive. So you need to communicate in advance of somebody asking you for something in order to be able to actually work efficiently here. So let me show you some pictures of some of the teams we were looking at. Microsoft used to have an office in Vancouver, Canada, in British Columbia, where Microsoft is in Seattle, maybe 2.5 hours south. But there's a big US border in the way, which prevented people from moving. And people would go to the Vancouver office if they couldn't get a visa to the US. But they would work with a team in the US. So they could talk online, but they could not actually visit each other or see each other ever. And so these pictures are basically pictures of like what the team looks like with the manager, the teammates, and the new employee who's always on the bottom left. And that new employee, those lines, the thicknesses of lines are kind of a measure of how much communication we were seeing between these people. So we kind of call this network a clan. In this environment, the new employee here actually is able to talk to talk to everybody. That's a fully connected clique, which is nice. We also have other strongly connected cliques, these 3 sets of people. Again, the manager and the teammates are in Redmond, and the new employees in Canada. And there, the lines were not as thick, actually, so there was not as much communication with them, but they had connectivity to everybody on the team. We also saw hub and spoke teams, where basically the new employee who's on the left has good visibility to the manager, but not to anybody else on the team because the manager is the one who controlled information flow. So everyone talks to the manager talks to everybody else, but nobody knew that the new employee existed, and the new employee never got to talk to them, never actually got to find out, like, one of the things that I look at a lot, I used to look at a lot was promotions and advancement, and at a company like Microsoft, you have to go above and beyond what you've been asked to do in order to get promoted. And What does it mean to go above and beyond? Well, normally you would look at other people's work and see how they got promoted. You would talk to them about lunch and they would tell you about the cool new thing they'd built. But when you don't go to lunch with them, you can't talk to them. You don't talk to them about other things exactly about what's in that meeting. Well, you don't ever get to see what does it take to get promoted. And then it turns out if they don't know you exist, hey, you don't get promoted. We have the last team I just want to show you. This one's actually a weekly connected team. The new employee had kind of okay visibility to the manager, but again, very poor visibility to the other people on the team. And that usually led to them suffering a lot and stagnating in their careers. And they had just gotten hired, so they were like super eager to show off how awesome they are, but they were not able to do that. So when we were looking at the thicknesses of lines, we were thinking about quantifying communication. So there's a way that we tend to do this in our field called a socio-technical dependency graph. And basically what that means is if I write some code that calls code that you wrote, then we're connected. And I created a tool called Codebook, which connects all the code and the bugs and the test cases and everybody who touches those things together to build a network of people. And Conway's law says, the same Conway's law from before, if there's a dependency between the things that we build, there should be communication between us in order to be able to talk about what we're building together, because they're touching each other, they're going to affect each other. And it turns out, we call this congruence. If the right communication is happening, we call this highly congruent. So what we do is we mine the communication. So we look at the software repositories, work on databases, bugs, mailing lists, public calendars. We tend not to go deep into the weird private stuff. We don't bug your phone calls and stuff like that. But we look for what's the communication that's occurring between people, and we check, is there communication occurring across those dependency boundaries? And pretty much every single study that's come out shows that if you are not communicating across a boundary that exists, you're very, very likely to have bugs in that software. And you'll notice it when you ship that software. What was also cool is if people are communicating across links that don't exist, so now you are basically butting into other people's work, that also correlates with bugs. So you should be communicating only according to the dependency links and not anything else. But we're humans, so we talk to our friends, and we have friends on other teams, and we have opinions about their software. And that means we're going to say those opinions, and we're going to get in the way, and definitely hurt the software. So the lesson here is basically that you need to communicate the right amount. So how do we do that? Well, there's been an introduction of something called agile software methods. And basically, it's a set of software engineering practices and best practices that align the development team more with the customer or any of the customers internally or externally, and makes them think about how to talk to everybody else. So this is basically, there was a book from the 90s that was all about agile software development. Everyone's like, what's this? It's basically from a bunch of teams that have worked together for an incredibly long amount of time, and actually those teams still work together today. And they basically just collected all their practices, put them in a book, and said, everybody should do this. And all the researchers were like, what? We didn't approve this. So we decided to go and study these things, and we found actually for many of those practices, there were lots of really good things that happened to them. So what we find that really works in Agile is a lot of feedback loops. And these are communication feedback loops between developers. Like they have a daily stand-up meeting where they get to say, what are you up to today? What did you do since yesterday? Or they, after they work for a few weeks and they produce a product or like a milestone of their product, they say, how did it go? How was our process? Should we fix the process in any way and make this better? So they reflect, which is really nice. If you're talking to your customers, we don't just deliver something after 3 or 4 years, which is kind of the way the defense industry still works, but you deliver weekly. And you ask the customer, what do you think? Here's the thing you said that you wanted, and here's what I built for you. What do you like about it? And in fact, when they tell you, in fact, that's not really what I wanted, then you've only wasted a week of work to fix things. And so frequent communication really improves things, and again, being proactive about it. So this supports coordination. If you continuously communicate, you're promoting transparency. So transparency mitigates your risk of depending on other people to get your work done, which is kind of a key lesson here. It doesn't mean, it's not always a positive thing. So if the team members all talk to each other and they tell them what they're going to do, great. But it doesn't mean, so it means basically, if I'm going to screw you over, I'll do it to your face. Like, I will tell you I'm going to screw you over before I do it. It's not going to stop me from doing that, but at least you'll know, and that means you have time to mitigate that risk and deal with it before it happens. As opposed to surprises. People hate surprises. Nobody likes surprises. So proactive communication solves those surprise problems. So I just want to go take a pause for a second and switch back to just basic communication. So obviously, this group understands this. Basically, you're sharing information between individuals to try to reach some kind of common ground. And we have our communication process where there's people who are sending information messages to other people through some kind of encoding, through a medium. It returns back to a receiver who then responds. And throughout all of it, there's lots of noise. Now, this is where we kind of transition into this autism space. There are lots of distractions in the communication process that are related to differences in communication styles and preferences, often between autistic and non-autistic people or neurotypical people. And like an example might be like if we're on a Zoom call and there's a really cool picture behind you, I might stare at the picture and not actually listen to what you're telling me, which is not great. Or maybe you're in a room with lots of other people and people are chatting in the back. And that kind of noise can interfere with my ability to hear and understand, or at least decide to pay attention to what you're telling me. Autistic people, and I think some people, we've talked a little bit about it today. I heard some people talk about autism. They have a wide range of abilities, let's call it characteristics and communication preferences that differ from non-autistic people in a way that's very noticeable to non-autistic people. But I don't want to leave it there. There's this notion of what we call double empathy problem that basically says the converse is true. Neurotypical people don't understand autistic people, and autistic people don't understand neurotypical people. And they're both equally have issues. It's almost like two different cultures are meeting and they just don't get each other. They understand the words, but not the meaning, and not the reasons why you'd be saying those things. So we did collect in a project that worked on effective communication, we collected misunderstandings that were happening between autistic and non-autistic people. And I kind of put them in a big table. So these are what neurotypical people think when they hear an autistic person say something. So like an autistic person might be super detail-oriented, and the neurotypical person thinks, oh, well, why are they telling me all these details? They're missing the big point. Like, what is the point? If an autistic person corrects factually incorrect information, they're just like, you're just a know-it-all. Why does this matter? They don't care about the detail of that information. It's just like, it's wrong, so it must be corrected. They might offer unsolicited help. And then they think, well, that person's just nitpicking me and trying to tell me how to do my job, which a lot of autonomous teams do not like. Autistic people aren't always aware of their tone and their volume as they speak. And when they do get emotional or excited, they might yell. And that might induce the neurotypical person to think, wow, that's really unprofessional. You shouldn't be yelling in public. And the autistic person actually has no conscious idea that they are yelling, even if it's happening. Let me switch to the other one. So autistic people also believe that a lot of neurotypical people are saying things that are really annoying, like small talk, which is just a waste of time. Or non-autistic people like to tell a lot of white lies all the time. Like, it just comes out of their mouths literally all the time. And autistic people hate it. They're just like, no, you're telling a lie. Like, you have to, they'll correct you. Like, that's not even allowed to be, you can't abide it for any amount of time. Or non-autistic people tend to talk around what they really want you to do. So like, I'll tell you, hey, the copier is broken. And you're like, great, I won't use it. But what I'm really saying is, I need you to go fix that copier. But I'm not saying it. And so that's a challenge. So what we try to do is to improve this kind of communication. And the way we do that is basically try to understand and accommodate to one another's styles. So this is something like, many autistic people, let's say you're 18, you have a pretty good understanding of how to talk to your parents. You've been around for a very long time, you've learned to accommodate to each other. The challenge is when you're working with people at work, you've only met them recently. You don't know who they are or how to talk to them. So what we try to make sure people are able to do is to develop clear expectations of behavior, of social norms. We like when people can explicitly negotiate their communication preferences, like, do you feel comfortable showing your face in a video call? Do you like to have an agenda before meetings start? What happens if you need to multitask during meetings? Does that make you comfortable or uncomfortable? So like you can talk about those things and decide how are we going to have this meeting together and explicitly talk about those things to make it more easily. And again, communicating proactively is really important. So I teach a course every year called Preparing Autistic Students for the AI Workforce. So we teach them AI, but we also teach them teamwork and communication skills and then place them in summer internships because I want to get people jobs. And what we really look for is how do we improve the pedagogy around teaching teamwork and communication to autistic people. And so what we do is we scaffold the crap out of all the communication skills that they need to learn. We give them scripts for how to read documents, how to write documents, how to speak to people, how to introduce themselves to a team, how to give feedback or receive feedback. We literally write out exactly what should you say and give them rules on how you should respond and what kinds of things you respond by. It kind of works really well, except that we found that many autistic people come with maybe, let's call it, poor social emotional learning skills. So many of them have prior experiences with trauma and marginalization. Many of them come with social anxiety. Imposter syndrome is everywhere. And it leads them to, they understand what communication we're asking them to do, but they don't seem to be able to do it. So this year, we are putting in social emotional learning into our curriculum to improve that. I have one more project I'm just show you really quickly. Basically, it's a project that's a collaboration with a lot of people here at University of Maryland called Intent, and it's a video game to help teach empathy to non-autistic people to the autistic people in the workplace. And so usually when you're with an autistic person, they behave differently than you're expecting. And so often you have a choice. Are you going to be an ally or are you going to be a bully? Or maybe you just don't know what to say and you could be anything you want. So we have a game where you get to practice this with 3 different scenes and learn what is it like to be a bully, what will that do to people, what was it like to pick the ally choice, and we give you explanations of what those choices are. In this particular example, it's about bright lights and whether or not you want to help this Ash guy handle the sensory overload of bright lights. So that project is actually at the point where we're trying to pilot test with autistic people to make sure we're representing them in a way that they like. And hopefully it will then go to industry companies to sort of actually start training people so that they can be nice to their autistic colleagues. So I just want to end here with some takeaways from the talk. So basically, to build big software requires teamwork, it requires good coordination and very timely communication. But the structure of the way that people work and how they're organized really impacts whether this communication can happen, whether it does happen, whether it's happening enough. And we try to use agile feedback loops to right-size that communication, to make sure it's actually happening in the right amount with the right set of people in the room. And beyond that, once you actually get the communication network itself to behave, then you got to make sure that the people who are communicating with each other know how to communicate together and understand and empathize with each other so that they can communicate effectively and not just hate each other. And once that can work, then you could actually build a really effective team, which builds really effective software, and you could ship a lot of really cool products and make a lot of money. So that's kind of what I seem to be doing for the last 20 years, and I continue to do that at CMU, and it's all just about helping people communicate on teams. So thanks very much.
We have time for 15 minutes of questions. Remember, please, that the line over there is for more senior folks, and the line over here is for more junior folks. The purpose of this rule is to give junior people a chance to come up and ask their questions. So if you would rather ask your question over there, go do it. Just, please come ask them over here if you have them.
All right, go ahead.
I go.
You're the only one. Go ahead.
Okay.
You're number one. Highest priority.
Hi, I'm Tim from Finding Five. We are one of the sponsors for the conference. I'm actually a cognitive scientist by training, but during the COVID period, I started the Finding Five project, which lets people do online experiments, right? So provides a lower technical barrier for students, for starting graduate students to do barrier. And one of the challenges we have faced is one, I have not been ever trained as a software person, right? So I can write code, but I found myself thrown into the position of leading a nonprofit organization made up of entirely volunteers who do this for the labor of love, right? So, and
Great.
Everybody has different schedules and like that. So we had a huge issue of communication, like what you have described, but that's on the scale of much, much smaller. We have about 10-ish volunteers on any sort of ongoing basis, right? And I just want to share sort of a comment-ish question, which is the asynchronous style of communication, right? So I think a lot of the things that you have touched upon assumed a tech company where people sort of have daily stand-ups, and these things are not quite practical in either a smaller setting, and it can be perceived as very it gives people a lot of pressure and anxiety if you try to implement that in a research lab type of style, right? So when I was a grad student, we had weekly lab meetings, and that was already quite stressful because you are sort of supposed to present updates on a weekly basis, right? So the idea was, would you think it's possible, or maybe it's a agile-ish optimal modification to the ideas of daily stand-ups, transparent communications, to let people do things as offline as possible, right? To make things as asynchronous as possible, to give the people, the students or whoever software engineers they may be, the time to reflect on what they need to do, what kind of help they need, right? Then make more thoughtful and helpful communications, also asynchronously to the rest of the teams. And from my perspective, that seems to work for us, right? As a purely 100% volunteer organization, that seems to work. But I was wondering if there was any kind of a theoretical, more scientific findings that may lend support to these kind of ideas.
All right,
Thank
good
you.
question. I mean, I'll just state at the outset, Agile is not a religion. So it's actually even designed to be adaptable for your particular team, and you change the methods that work for you. It is completely, there are many, many, many startup companies and even larger companies like even GitHub that are purely remote. They have no office anywhere. All the people who work for them, even hundreds to thousands of people, just work from their house and only have asynchronous communication with the other people on the teams. And that works. However, whenever you have an asymmetry in this, when you have everybody asynchronous, it's great. When you have everybody synchronous and in the same room, it's great. Whenever you have something hybrid is where you get into trouble. And so like I'll give you an example in that coding course for autistic students. Some of the autistic students were not willing to talk by their microphone, and certainly not at the beginning of the course when they didn't know anybody, and they wanted to type. And typing is a lot slower than speaking, and so we would have team discussions, let's say brainstorming, where the people who would speak could get out 15 ideas by the time one person could type an idea. And the brainstorming exercise was just totally like broken. We had to fix it. I mean, we're thinking about using some kind of Miro board where they do Post-it notes or something, but like to take away the power of the person who is speaking as to go faster. So the speed differences are the real problem, I think, that happens with hybrid development. So as long as everybody's purely asynchronous, they could take all the time they need as long as the dependencies are met, and you can actually succeed incredibly well. But as soon as two people get into the same room together, they're just going to start blabbing to each other and make decisions without everybody else who's not in the room, and that's going to lead to problems on your team.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, we are 100% asynchronous, right? So
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Question over here.
Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm at Cornell, and my background is in CS, so thank you for doing this work. I think it's a really important topic. I think that a lot of research on like autistic and neurodivergent people is like on like the, I guess, misinterpretations between like neurodivergent people and neurotypical people, but I'm also interested in like the within group dynamics. So like you said, it's when neurodivergent and neurotypical people interact, it's sort of like a clash of cultures. So I'm interested, or I'm curious whether you've maybe looked at like the communication dynamics within teams of like where there are a lot of autistic people, and whether their communication is like more or less efficient than communication between like neurotypical people.
Really good question. In the course that we taught for autistic students, I've also taught a coding camp for purely autistic students. We're teaching them about teamwork with just autistic people in the room because I thought it would be easier. So instead of dealing with power issues, social issues with the neurotypicals, let's just give them an easier starting point. They still don't know what to say. They still don't know how to have a standing meeting or how to communicate proactively. Sometimes they just work silently. And for them, some of them, they're very happy to do that and work silently next to each other. And for me, as I'm a person with ADHD, so I guess neurodivergent but not autistic, I don't know if you had a purely autistic team, what is the right way for that team to work together so they could get the communication they need to have but still feel authentically autistic. I have one graduate student who's actually working on that and really trying to dive into what does authenticity mean for groups of purely autistic people or purely people with ADHD where they don't have to mask. And even in groups where you have one autistic person and one ADHD person, they're so different. Even ADHD to ADHD is super different. And they have all sorts of clashes because you just get the opposite personalities and they don't know how to resolve those problems. And that's more general of like generally people don't know how to work in groups, which is why the entire field of organizational science exists. So we try to teach them that, and that teaching applies to both mixed groups and homogeneous groups.
Thank you.
Cool. Hi.
Jesse, this is a great segue to the question that I wanted to ask, or maybe the problem I wanted to pose, right? I think there's two ways of thinking about the double empathy problem. Mm-hmm. One way seems pretty straightforward. Whenever there are two people in an interaction and those two people vary in multiple ways, there is going to be difficulty on each of their parts in understanding one another, and they must each take responsibility for this interaction. Good. Easy, right? Or not easy, but simple. The other one, I think, brings in a naive essentialism to understanding minds, right? It says, and human beings love it. We love categories, right? So it says, aha, there are neurotypical people. There are people with autism. There are people with ADHD. And the problem happens when you get communication across these different groups. I've recently tried to comb the literature, and that leads to some predictions. It predicts, for example, that autistic people should be able to interact better with other autistic people than with neurotypical people, and vice versa. And you threw in ADHD into the mix. I've recently tried to scour through the literature to find evidence that actually supports that construal of the double empathy problem. It's really hard to find. And in fact, I can't find anything with males in it that supports that construal of the double empathy problem. And I wonder if the idea of kinds is what is at the heart of the problem here, right? Neurodiversity is incredibly rich. For example, I think if you look at folks with fairly strong intellectual powers on the autism spectrum, the co-occurrence of that in ADHD is up around 30 or 40%. Mm-hmm. So we certainly don't want to think about those as different kinds. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, how does this affect how you write this curriculum or how you think about this training?
A really, really good question. As I continually hear from autistic people, if you've met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. They're all very different. In the same way that every single person in this room is very different from each other in a variety of different ways. What we tend to do is we focus our research first on, and the pedagogy kind of first on just, let's assume you're an archetype. But every day in our course specifically, we're teaching, let's say, 15 to 20 students at a time. We have usually 5 to 6 instructors for those 15 to 20 students, because again, this is kind of like a research-supported project, not just a typical class. Every day after each class, we have a debrief of where we go over every single student and we say, who is this student? What do they like? What do they need? What do we need to do with them differently tomorrow? And treat them as individuals. Because yes, all autistic students are very different from each other. There are some that are sensory seeking, some that are sensory avoidant, some that chat and don't shut up, and some that are purely super quiet. And they're quiet for different reasons. And we have to like reach each student individually in order to be able to get them to communicate well with us, as well as to get them to communicate with each other, which takes just takes a huge amount of effort. But I feel like our course is 10 weeks long. By the time we've reached, usually about week 3, we kind of know them pretty well, and we can actually start accommodating their needs, as well as then when they do project work, accommodating the particular styles of the project team. We actually put the project team together based on what we know of each individual, and try to match up people who are similar to each other, so we don't put all the quiet people with the people who are super chatty, because then the chatty people talk and leave the quiet people out. That's not good. So let's get all the quiet people in the room together so they're more symmetric, and then we can get them to talk, and they'll feel more comfortable talking amongst people who are similar to them. So it's maybe an emergent similarity grouping as opposed to one that we just labeled people. In fact, in all the research I do, I really try I would like to move the field past labels, and in fact, just refer to different cognitive attributes that people have and where you might sit on some kind of continuum. But that makes everybody completely unique, and certainly it's difficult to do machine learning, it's difficult to do pedagogy, it's difficult to pretty much do anything when you just assume everybody's completely different from each other. So we do have to do some generalizations in order to actually like create a class in the first place. Sure.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Satvik from here at UMD, and I was a software engineer before grad school, so I wanted to sort of bring together the work on cross-team communication, which is like separately very interesting, and so the curriculum that you're teaching to these autistic students in your school, in these courses. So how much do you focus on like within team versus cross-team communication, and like what are the different skills that you might teach when, say, communicating with like somebody in a different role, like a manager versus your teammate versus like another developer who's like the same level on another team you need to work with, and how do you sort of navigate all of those different use cases?
Really good question. So in the past, when I studied teams at Microsoft, we found that intra-team, like inside team communication, there were no problems at all, because they talked to each other every day, they sat on the same hallway, they went to lunch together, there were no problems. Inter-team communication, there were a ton of problems, they always had challenges in communication. When I then switch over to try to teach students, they're working in teams that are all egalitarian. They're basically democratic teams, there's no leader. I tried to do a course where we added a leader, and that didn't go so well. So we don't have a leader, and it's all intra-team communication, but it also still completely fails because they don't know each other. They're not motivated by the same interests. Some want an A, some want a B, some want a C, some don't care, and that leads to challenges. So they have challenges in communication because of motivation. It's not necessarily the same kind of challenges that you would see in an industry company, but it's of the same flavor of effect on the team. So when we're teaching the autistic students, we're worried about intra-team communication and just getting them to talk at all and communicate about what they're doing, because they don't always seem to realize that when they work alone, that the other people don't understand what's going on inside their heads and that they should talk about it. So we get them to talk, and we're happy. We're successful at that point.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
One very quick, I'll just speak quickly. I'm Jerry Altman, University of Connecticut, basketball center of the world. I just wanted to ask about Conway's law that you mentioned at the beginning, and I was sort of intrigued about that because I just wondered, what are the origins of that, and to what extent are the teams that people typically build flexible and responsive or reactive to the unfolding software development? So I can imagine that some teams are just fossilized. That's, we've got this team that do this, they do the graphics, this team do the coding, this team do whatever. And I can imagine other times that there's a project manager who decides, I'm going to put a team together to do this. Where does Conway's law come from in all of this, and how flexible is it?
So I'll give you the quick answer because we don't have a lot of time. So the quick answer is that the emergence of who's talking to whom seems to be both a function of the principles you define your architecture to be, your software architecture, but it's also defined by the principles of how your human organizations are defined. So if people like each other, they're going to work together, then those two people are going to work on the same thing because they'll be on the same team. And there was one example that I thought was really great, which is there's Bell Labs used to build telephone switching software, and then it got moved to India. What they did is they took their software, they threw it over the wall to India, and they didn't send any people with it. And all they had was a source code base, and they had a bug database. Within 2 weeks, the Indian team had organized itself in an exact replica of the team in New Jersey without having ever met them or known them or anything, just by looking at the software and figuring out how they should organize themselves. So it's embedded somehow in the architecture of the software itself, how the people should be communicating. And I thought that blew my mind. That was pretty awesome. So it's really cool. Datamation, 1958. And he was not a computer scientist because there was no computers back then, but he was just like a business analyst. Very smart guy. Thank you.